Welcome to the Black Magic Woman Podcast with Mundanara Bales.
It's about us as Aboriginal people, regardless of title.
You know, relationalism, not war making, is the best way to have security.
Now is the best time to be a blackfellow, especially in business.
It's so powerful to see successful Aboriginal women.
I am a survivor of the stolen generations.
I'd like to begin this podcast by acknowledging the Gubbi Gubbi peoples here on the Sunshine Coast. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We have never ceded our sovereignty as First Nations peoples, living in this country now known as Australia. My name is Mundanara Bales and I am the host of Black Magic Woman Podcast. So welcome to the show. And if you have just recently started following the podcast, thank you. And to people not just around Australia, but now all over the world that have been downloading this podcast, I want to say thank you. And also acknowledge the traditional owners from all of those countries all around the world that are now, you know, able to have a listen and listen to conversations that matter. And the people that I get to talk to and engage with, interact with, build relationships with, come from all walks of life, not just First Nations peoples, but people who are doing amazing things in our community in this country. I haven't had anyone on yet outside of Australia, so maybe in 2022, who knows? The format is 20% business and 80% basically on relationships or the personal stuff. So I'm going to hand over now to my guest, who is Luke Briscoe. Brother, welcome to the podcast and thank you so much for jumping on today.
Yunda, thank you for having me on the show. Nyago Budi Kudbo Wawa Kudbo. I'm Luke Briscoe. I'm a proud Kuku-Yalanji man from far north Queensland. My family is the Walker family up in Daintree region. A lot of people know Uncle Bennett and his sons, Juan Walker and Brendan and Link. But that's my family, and Daintree is my homeland.
Too deadly. So I guess for our listeners, take us back to, where is the Daintree? What was it like growing up there? Or did you grow up somewhere else, like off country?
Yeah, so the Daintree is a beautiful rainforest area that borders right onto the reef, and they call it the rainforest of the reef. To us, it's Mudja. It's our source of life, and we pay whole respect to our Mudja. Growing up, when I was young, we grew up in Innisfail, which is a little bit more south of like Cairns and Daintree region. My mother grew up in the Daintree mission in the mission days around the 60s, and then she was taken away as a kid, sent to Townsville, like a lot of other families. Was taken away, and then years later, she moved, close enough to Innisfail to be with her family. A lot of the families that have been taken away have that. There's a slight disconnect that would have happened. So for us, seeing how our mother Jungaji, how she lived through that, really helped shape us on the need to really make sure that we were connected to country. We really people might know the Briscoe sisters and a lot of the work that that's right, and the work that we're doing to really reconnect and really help vitalize our cultures, and really trying to work to really showcase Yalanji culture, and that's pretty much what my journey's been since since I've started working. Yeah.
So when I think about my family, I've got 8 sisters. I don't have any brothers, and 24 nieces and nephews, so quite a big family. Did you grow up in a big family? You got like big mob of family? Are you married? You got children? Tell me more.
Yeah, definitely. I've you got 6 other siblings, and sadly my mum and dad have passed on, but you know, they're through their work, you know, lives through us, and myself, I've got a you know, long-time Jolu that Amber Roberts that I've been with since I was in my teens. We've got 2 kids and 2 beautiful girls, Topaz Wubble Wubble Briscoe, Yalanji, word for butterfly, and Phoenix Unba. The Phoenix, her middle name is the honeybee, the native honeybee up in the north. So we are trying to raise our kids to be, you know, connected to their culture, and, you know, one part of, you know, of how we can do that, you know, simply is just by continuing the tradition of having their Yalanji names.
Of course. Do you know, brother, I had this conversation with one of my kids recently. His name is Jaida Jandamara, and Jaida means gift. In the language of it's Yungo Martha, so from Arnhem Land. And David Gopalil's son is Jaida, and that's where my mum loved the name, because she was really good friends with one of David's first uncle, one of his first girlfriends, and she brought this little boy to Redfern. He was 6 years old, but his name was James Gopalil. And James's, I think it might be James's little brother or older brother, was Jaida. So my mum named my little sister Jaida because Jaida was born on Christmas Day, and Jaida means gift. So when I had my son, he was born as white as a ghost, same as my little sister Jaida, white as a ghost with these big blue eyes. And my husband's Fijian. I'm like, how did I have a white kid? Like, I just couldn't believe how white this kid was. But beautiful, like beautiful looking child with these big, bright blue eyes. So I named him Jaida because he looked exactly like my little sister. And I just felt this, like I had to name him Jaida. Anyways, his middle name is Jandamara, and Jandamara was a warrior. So anyways, recently he said to me, he goes, Mum, I hate my middle name. Why did you give me this stupid name, Jandamara? And he kind of mocked his own name. And I said, and he's 9 years old, he's in grade 4. And I said to him, you know what? I hated my name growing up too. Mundanara means rainbow in the Birigaba language, near your country. We're the Wiri people outside of Townsville, around Nebo. And all through school, like about 13 different schools, you know, when kids found out your name was Mundanara, they just teased the shit out of you. And when they found out that you were Aboriginal, then the bullying and teasing went to a whole nother level. Yep. Like, it was not a cool thing to be Aboriginal and not to have an Aboriginal name growing up in this country in the 80s, right? Early 90s. So here's my son now in 2021 saying to me, why didn't you just give me a normal name? And I said, you know what? It took me at least 18 years to embrace my first name. I said, at least you like Jaida. No one needs to know your middle name anyways. So I love the fact that you've given your daughters that Yalanji name so that they can, you know, be proud and know who they are and where they come from. And that was the whole reason why our parents, my mum and dad, gave us Aboriginal names. So I just felt a connection there when you talked about having those names was really important to you, because that's the way that they can stay connected to their Yalanji culture. Where are you raising your children, if you don't mind me asking? Like, where are you in the country?
Yeah, so I've been living in Sydney for about 10 years now. We made the decision now to move back close to homelands in Cairns and continue the work of that I do around embedding Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge systems and science in Cairns now. So you're just in the process of moving everything back to Cairns. But it's been really good. I'm actually on Gadigal country at the moment, and it's a beautiful day in Sydney. But yeah, you know, it's just one of those things. Particularly during COVID, I just felt, like these kids are locked indoors and they're not connected to to, community, the Redfern community, but then also they're not connected to no one, and then they're having connecting with their cousins via Skype and even Roblox and Minecraft and all those games and stuff. So they've asked, can we go back north? Can we learn more about our culture? So we decided, okay, well, it's enough now for me and Amber to, work in the corporate sector and do all that stuff. Let's go back and do something in our own communities. And
well, you're in that position now, basically, right? You're in that position where you can take the family and go back to country. And I can tell you now, I've just moved to Sunshine Coast, to Mount Coolum, and in the Gubbi language, it's Gullum. And my kids are loving it. I live on a mountain 70 metres above sea level, and the ocean is down the bottom of the road. 3 minutes drive, we're at the beach, and then we go back up to, the kids call it their mountain, claiming it already. But we've been here for a year, and the quality of life, even though I'm not on my country, just leaving the city. So I've been in Brisbane for 25 years, and my kids were born in Brisbane. And, I took them to Sydney a lot. But when I took them back to Redfern, and that's where I'm from, obviously, there was nobody there. I couldn't knock on the door of my auntie's house or my uncle's house, and my both parents have passed as well. And, brother, I connected with that straight away because I talk about that all the time, that my kids don't have grandparents because of the life expectancy of our people. My mum and dad passed. My mum died at 45 and my dad passed at 62. So they had reached their life expectancy, because 20 years ago it was 55 for my mum. And, in the last 5 years, life expectancy was 72 for Aboriginal men. So for my dad to get to 62, that was quite an achievement. So I connected with you straight away when I say that it's not uncommon, and I say this at Black Card training, it's not uncommon to meet an Aboriginal person my age, I'm 38, and not to have their parents alive. And grandparents were gone a long time ago. So that's a society of young people growing up without any grandparents.
That's right. And it's vitally important for us to have that community support to raise our kids as well. So even though we don't have our they don't have their grandparents, at least they've got all their cousins and aunties.
Or that extended family. That's what I always say. You know what? Let's draw from our strengths, not from our weaknesses, because our culture, I'm being biased here, is the most beautifulest culture that I would say in the world, because my sisters are mothers to my children, and my grandmother's brothers and sisters are also grandmothers and grandfathers to our children. So it's not that they miss out on it, but nothing replaces your own mum and dad, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I always think how important it is, in our cultures, that we put our kids at the highest level. Like in Yalanji culture, kids are considered as the old people because they're closest to the ancestors, than we are. So it's important, and they connect to Binyo and all those type of spiritual beliefs, that we believe as well. So.
Oh my God! Look, you and I haven't even really met before, right? And there's so much in common. Like, I just delivered a training session, 4 hours, to ANZ Bank, and I was just talking about it like 2 hours ago, how Aboriginal society is a lateral, in terms of our governance structure, it's a lateral governance structure. So it's not about, kings and queens, monarchies and leaders and chiefs. So it's not hierarchical in a sense like Western society. And a lot of other Indigenous cultures, right, the Maori culture, the Aboriginal, Canadians, Native Americans, African nations, they're all chieftainship societies, right? There's someone at the top and it's usually a male. Aboriginal society is a flat system where, elders sit just above the group. Like they're like an elite that does not rule. And children are part of the group. So we see little people as little adults in training. They're independent thinking, autonomous beings, which means they're their own authority figure. So talking about Aboriginal child rearing practices at Black Card gets people to truly understand how Aboriginal people bring up children and therefore why we are the way we are. So my little daughter, Tiger Lily, she's the youngest. She's the boss of the house. So when you said that, with little people, that they're treated as equals, they're respected equals to adults, right? They're part of the group. We hold or we place, in terms of that, they're not a high value on little people, but they're not less than. Like, they're not excluded. And I loved how you connected it to our ancestors, that they are closer to our ancestors than us. I've never heard that before, Braz, and I absolutely loved it.
And we have to learn more from them, because they're that connection to our ancestors that that we might be missing, as particularly like growing up in generations of stolen generations, and it's important to have these spiritual beliefs. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talks about allowing Indigenous peoples to have their spiritual beliefs and rights, but we need to put that in practice, and we really need to understand really what that means. And I try and think about how does that impact me on a daily life? How does it impact my business and practice, and how I communicate with people as well? And, like we talk about the I do a lot of work in looking at embedding Indigenous knowledge systems in science, and I'm looking at the four elements. Earth being bubu up our way, and then water being bana, and then fire being kunjan, and then wind being wenba. So really trying to understand, maybe we need to, when we talk about Indigenous education systems and all that stuff, add the fifth element, which is the wawu, is our spirit. So the making sure, and you can embed these practices, as your own personal cultural framework, or you'll embed these practices as your business plan, the structure and how you have relationships with land, culture and people.
Well, to see us as equals first, and I'm talking about mainstream Australia, right?
Yeah.
They need to see us as equals and not less than. And if they can see us as equals, then hopefully they'll value what we have to share with them, in terms of the fact that it wasn't that long ago that Aboriginal people were running an entire country. Like, we ran this country for tens of thousands of years without any outside interference, without any need for police or prisons or armies. And we never invaded our neighbours in our whole history of living in this country. So there's a whole lot of experiences and developments and inventions, like, how do you get along with your neighbours without invading them? And you talked about relationships. Like, relationships are fundamental in everything that I do at Black Card and outside of Black Card. And I would say, and a lot of people say this, that I'm the queen of relationships. And that's why this podcast means the world to me, because I get to talk to people like yourself and get to understand, who are you? And then it kind of makes sense to them when we hear about what you do, which we will do in a moment. But we've actually built a relationship with each other, and that relationship, breaks down barriers, and it builds trust, and it builds rapport, it does a whole lot of things, but it minimises the potential for conflict, and that's really important when you've got a country like Australia with over 300 different nationalities that now live in this country, and they too call this place home. How do we get along with each other? But more importantly, how can we learn from the accumulated knowledge that either developed or evolved over the tens of thousands of years that we've lived in this country? And that's what we refer to at Black Card as Aboriginal terms of reference. Dr. Lilla Watson, my grandmother's sister, and Dr. Mary Graham, her best friend, sister and colleague, talk about Aboriginal terms of reference all the time. It's our knowledge, our governance, our logic, our way of building relationships, our definitions of spirituality, or our definitions of land. Like, blackfellas need to be in a position, and I think we are, of having to describe ourselves to the rest of the world. And then we start to educate people about how to behave. If you're going to acknowledge traditional owners, then that's one way, of being respectful. But then what's the next step? And I love the fact you talked about country. So obligations to country. How do we get everyday Australians to see themselves as caretakers of country? Because once they start to care for something that's greater than themselves and outside of themselves, which is country, the land, then that becomes a template for then how they treat people. How you treat land is a template for how you treat people. So all of this knowledge that we've got as blackfellas that we could share with everyone, and on this podcast, it's an opportunity for my listeners to get a cultural education, if you want to call it that, but an insight into the lives of blackfellas like yourself. But for people to start really embracing Aboriginal culture, celebrating Aboriginal culture, the fact that we are the oldest surviving continuous culture in world history, and yet most Australians have no idea about Aboriginal people or culture. They don't really know anything about this country, and they might go back 8 generations or come from the First Fleet and yet probably know nothing about this country. So after the break, I'd love for you to share with us the work that you've been doing at Indigi Lab, and also I heard that you're a science broadcaster. So that intrigues me. So we'll come back and we'll go straight into, what you've been doing and also where to from here. So welcome back. And as I said before the break, I am, just as interested as all of you fellas that are listening in terms of what is Indigi Lab and how did you start your business? So this is the part where we want to know, what do you do?
Indigi Lab is all about embedding Indigenous rights in the STEAM sector and making sure that Indigenous knowledge systems are protected and maintained, particularly, in an environment where technology and AI is driving global economies. How does Indigenous knowledge fit into, the whole scheme of things? One way in which Indigi Lab's aiming to really protect Indigenous cultures around things like the SDG markets, ESD markets, is developing Indigenous cultural indicators. So the Indigenous cultural indicators are a theory of change model and a systems change approach that is directly or the evaluation methods and approaches directly comes from community and understanding how, what the indicators might be for a company going on their land at a certain period of the year. An example I give is looking at, up in the north, we have the traditional fire burning ceremonies and practices. So making sure that, like companies, if they want to work with Yalanji, that they have to look at these cultural indicators that are in place. They're linked to our spiritual beliefs and customs, and they're linked into our land practices. So making sure that they respect Indigenous cultural indicators as a way of understanding how better to work with Indigenous peoples to explore science and technology of the future.
Far out. That is unbelievable. So where do these cultural indicators come from? Who sets that? Is that part of the United Nations Declaration?
So so Indigenous Cultural Indicators is a project that was started through the Indigenous Peoples Major Group on the SDGs, and they did a lot of work with in New Zealand. A lady by the name of Tui Shortland has done a lot of work to look at mapping Māori culture to the Treaty of Waitangi, and then also looking at how it aligns to different global goals. Particularly, her focus was looking at youth health and well-being, using Indigenous cultural indicators as a guide to understand, through practice of continuing spiritual beliefs, how that has an impact on youth well-being. So Indigenous cultural indicators have been around for a couple of years, and also the United Nations, they have their own, they call them Indigenous, they call them cultural indicators. The UNESCO have defined, culture as a big key driver of new technologies. But my question is, well, whose culture is driving that? Particularly when you look at Indigenous peoples and how they've managed land and how our knowledge now is leading, the conversations around the impact of carbon emissions with traditional fire burning practices, being an example. So how are Indigenous communities, how are we responding to the impacts of climate change? And we've been doing it for thousands of years, but now it's really time to really step back and say, hey, let's pause for a minute. Let's look at this more holistic approach, which is the way our ancestors would have done it. Let's step back. Let's develop, a values systems. Indigenous cultural indicators are really value systems that align, Yalanji values with Gadigal values, and making sure that everyone's on the same path. So then when mining companies or when government agencies are looking to develop projects and programs, Indigenous cultural indicators are a tool which they can evaluate because it comes directly from the community. INDIGI LAB works with community to develop a co-designed approach to aligning cultural indicators with things like sustainable development goals.
Wow. I'm like just sitting here. I could listen to you all day, and I have never heard, I've heard of cultural indicators, but haven't really heard, it hasn't been described in the way that you describe it, and it makes sense now. How did you get into this work? Like when you started in DigiLab, what was the reason was there a gap there? Was there a experience? Was it your past job that kind of pissed you off and you started this company? How did you start the company, and how did you get into the work that you're doing? Did you go to university? Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so I have a background in coding and IT, and but then I'm one of those people that do a lot of other things. But what really grounded me in wanting to pursue a career as a cultural practitioner, working in science, is really looking at the first project I did on country was working with my uncle and the community on cultural mapping. So that really stood out. I spent a lot of my education background working, getting educated around science, around media and screens. So I naturally moved into NITV, where I worked on as a TV producer, as a digital producer, working on a range of different projects, and within that, even those systems, that we have in our institutions and media agencies, we can do, more to make sure that the protocols and processes internally and those structures are better governed, and some of what which is what the work that I did over at NITV or even with IndigiLab is all around developing good governance. I also studied arts management and at Melbourne Uni, and then I moved over to do more around coding. I did a fundamental coding program, and then did a data science program through SBS, internal program, which really kind of allowed me to think, about data sovereignty. I've been really, I suppose, lucky enough to pick the right different, subjects, and didn't really look at my education till I moved to Brisbane about 10 years ago. So really kind of looking at how I can further my education. It was a kind of a pivotal point in moving to Sydney, and then gaining that experience and further education, because looking at screen and media as a profession wasn't something in the 90s that you could foresee in Cairns. maybe if you wanted to get into radio. So,
Yeah.
so I had to, study abroad and really, really cement, a lot of my education down here. And I'm totally aware also that, through these education systems, and even, myself going through AFTR's screenwriting program, I saw some of the biases, some of the ways in which Indigenous, people were portrayed in writing, and to the point where, I could not, really, in terms of this is early 2000s, really looking at how, how we've gone from, having not much content to right now, leading Australia with media content. So I had an opportunity to, when I moved to Sydney 10 years ago, to develop the Media Ring Employment Program, and which has led the way for more Indigenous people working in screen and media and, seeing on TV. And it's this approach that I'm using now with INDIGI LAB is trying to develop a, thought leadership around how do we really protect Indigenous culture in a science space, because we don't really need more and more scientists to understand how our culture can be embedded in science. We need more scientists to understand how culture can be explored more ethically in science. So I call myself more of a cultural practitioner in science and technology, because ultimately that's what I'm doing is using my culture as a way to show and prove that Indigenous sciences and technologies are equal, or some would argue, even more invaluable than Western science, because they're based on, the first laws that were ever created,
Exactly. And that's what I was saying earlier, right, with children, to value, to see children as equals, but more importantly, to see us as black fellas as equals, because we're not treated as equals in this country. And therefore, our knowledge isn't valued, or it doesn't, I don't know, would you say credibility? It doesn't hold credibility, or because we didn't invent writing, therefore we didn't write down our culture. And because it's an oral culture, then if it's not proven in science, then it's not true. So a lot of our dreaming stories are now starting to match up with science, right?
That's right, yeah.
But why do we need science to validate our people and our existence in this country that goes back tens of thousands of years? But anyways, that's a question for another day. You're into science, maybe you've got an answer. But I just want to say that I also agree that our knowledge is of higher value. I believe that because, first of all, our knowledge comes from this country. Our knowledge doesn't come from somewhere over the ocean, right? So to me, it should hold higher value. Whereas,
I think,
you go.
Yeah, I think science is important for the use of dispelling a lot of the myths around mainly like Christianity or Cathism, a lot of the myths that existed. So I think for Western culture, science might have been a really good practice to evaluate whether or not a lot of the Christian beliefs around 5,000 years of being on this earth was actually plausible. So I think science has a place in terms of dispelling some of the myths of the Western world. But when we look at Indigenous cultures, our practices have been in place for thousands of years. So you don't need to start off with we're not starting off with a blank sheet. We have thousands of years of looking at science practices, from Indigenous ways that, like, for instance, looking at the traditional fire burning practices and how something so, uniquely to this country is having a massive impact on a global scale on the carbon scheme. So that's just, there's so many, deeper understandings that that we can draw from our own knowledge systems. But we're living in a world, I suppose we're living in what call the knowledge economy, where everyone's really pushing to understand more about AI. More that people do want to know more about Indigenous knowledge systems, but they don't want to go through the protocols in getting that knowledge. And particularly, I draw upon the new priority on the closing gap, which looks at data and looking at engaging communities to access data. To me, I see that as a bit of a rights-based issue, because that's community agency. Having control of our data and what we do is agency for us to self-determine. So this is the type of issues that we're going to be looking at in the next probably 10 years around data agency, and if we don't have good governance structures in place as our own communities and how we share knowledge, because one story in one country might be very similar to another country's story, say 20 kilometres down the road. So then how do we have a shared benefit of that one story that even though it might be named different, it's the same story in terms of what the Western world want in terms of the science and the technology that they can draw from those stories. So we talk about extracted industries, and I would say when you look at knowledge economy, extracting our knowledge is an extracted industry as well.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And I was just thinking, your organisation, do you work with corporates? Because I know that there's a big gap, right? You've got some of the biggest corporations in the country that can influence with all of their people. So if we talk about global warming and climate change, corporate Australia employ 1 million Australians in all their organisations. How do we get people on board? You're talking about sustainability. You spoke a little bit about climate change. There's lack of education in Australia when it comes to this country and Aboriginal culture and history as well. How do we get people to see this of value? You don't have to have a reconciliation action plan to see that, we're long overdue for action in this country, right? How do we create positive change in this country when we as blackfellas make up 3% of the population?
That's right. I think what we need to do as Indigenous business owners, in particular, or cultural practitioners working in various fields, is standing strong with our cultural integrity. Use the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples when even developing a concept of an idea, because once ideas get put through to the corporate sector or government, and unless you have really solid governance structures, they have their own governance structures or their own methods of evaluating a program that if we don't develop things like Indigenous cultural indicators at the starting point, we will be just continually run over, because we need to assert our rights, and companies like INDIGI LAB working with Black Card to develop Indigenous cultural indicators would be a really awesome movement to really.
Yes, I'm on board.
Get people to really think about how their cultural rights can easily be extracted, but having the Indigenous cultural indicators puts a bit of a brake on use of our knowledge. It makes sure that that if you're going to go into country that and run a project that might span from Sydney to Melbourne to Brisbane, an example might be Viola Waste Company, that they have to ensure that that they work within the Indigenous cultural indicators from the big cities, those 3 different jurisdictions or 4, So making sure that that we're on board first as Indigenous peoples too, because I see treaty and sovereignty and also the voice to Parliament. All these things are important, but having some, I suppose, like guidance around, well, then what does that actually mean when we talk about the voice to Parliament in terms of a basic fundamental step? And I see Indigenous cultural indicators as that fundamental step to getting people's value systems to align with Indigenous value systems.
I completely agree. And only last week, and I've got to give a shout out here to Monash Uni. I'm part of the first cohort of the master's program, the MBA, and it's the MBA and then in brackets, Indigenous Business Leadership. So the whole last week, 5-day intensive online on Zoom, because we can't go to Melbourne yet, we did Indigenous design thinking. And we were using the Indigenous Design Charter, the principles, and they aligned with what Annie Mary and Annie Lilla have been talking about, the Aboriginal terms of reference. Like, unbelievable when we talk about, respect and country, identity, community, governance, elders, and all of that stuff. So how do we get people? First, the education is key. They need to be educated. And, it's a huge disservice to the citizens of Australia today that past governments didn't educate them, or you, because you're listening to this, and you're probably saying, well, I grew up in this country and had no education about Aboriginal people. Well, let's think about, it's 2021 and we've got Google. So if you don't know, Google it. It's another shout out to Google. Thanks for Google. But with this, with education and with organisations and black businesses that are readily at your fingertips, you could Google us and find out how can you get, if it's an organisation that you're working in, if you've got a reconciliation action plan, well, that's a start. Because then you've got a business plan to achieve reconciliation. And there's the 3 pillars in reconciliation action plans, the respect, relationships, and opportunities. So we need to build relationships based on respect, and then having Aboriginal people and Torres and nbsp people at the table as, co-designing. Would you say that? But that we need to be at the table and co-design. You've got an article. I've been stalking you on LinkedIn. There was an article there about this, about Code Club, Australia's First Nations cultural framework. And I was trying to prepare myself for today. This framework, is that something that you are co-developing with these fellas, or are you part of this Code Club Australia?
So I'm developing their cultural framework for Code Club Australia, which is a Telstra Foundation initiative. And the starting point of this cultural framework, and in my knowledge, there's been no projects like this in the science and technology space, but we're embedding the 4 principles of the Declaration as our starting point to understand how better Code Club Australia is, can use this declaration in their project and program. So for the last month, we've had some consultations, online survey, but really just been ringing up people and having deep conversations about, well, what can an organisation that's non-Indigenous, what can they do to use this declaration as a starting point? Because RAP plans are great, but they don't, a lot of them don't use the 4 principles of the declaration as their starting point. And, hopefully, projects like this, there'll be more companies and government agencies using these, this type of cultural framework that looks at, the 4 key principles of the declaration: self-determination, participation, decision-making, respect for protection of culture, equity and non-discrimination. Yeah.
And I see that that people that are listening can have a look at this article on your LinkedIn page, because I downloaded it, and it's basically the discussion paper that was published in August 2021, a human rights-based approach to developing a First Nations cultural framework. Code Club Australia and Indigi Lab. Brother, I can't wait to read that, because I've just partnered with Ernst & Young to develop Commonwealth Bank's Indigenous engagement strategy, but it's based on the United Nations Rights of Indigenous People, the Declaration. So there is an opportunity here that I'm going to be reaching out to you after this podcast. I didn't know that you were involved in this with Code Club Australia. So I'm going to read this and see there's, a whole lot of opportunities that I think for you and I, but for people that are listening, if they want to reach out to you and connect with you in terms of they might be an individual, they may be a school teacher, or they may work for one of those big corporate organisations, how do people reach out to you? What's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, I'd say go to our website, indigilab, all one word, .com.au, and you can search our site, but also connect with us. Up on our top tab, you'll see a connect button. Just click on that, send a message, and we'll get back to you. But there's all great useful information on the site, some details about our projects and programs, looking at our impact, but more importantly is the work we're doing around the cultural indicators, and I see that as a way of connecting all people as well, through our network and the Indigenous Cultural Indicator Project.
I have never heard, I've heard these cultural indicators, and it was a long time ago, and now you've kind of put it back front and centre of my mind to go back in and have a look at it. We've developed a cultural capability framework, right? Dr. Mary Graham and Dr. Lilla Watson and Uncle Charlie, and we had help from an amazing businesswoman in Melbourne, Helene George, who has a company called Creative Economy. So we partnered together for this piece of work for CommBank back in 2014. And brother, I'll be honest with you, when we launched that framework at CommBank, this framework is all based on Aboriginal terms of reference. Yeah. They didn't know how to give us feedback. They couldn't even give us feedback on the framework we developed for them because it was too high level. Yeah. So then they came and done black card training, a 2-day intensive, and then was able to give us feedback on the framework. And what they said is that this is unbelievable. We're going to need black card now to implement the framework. 2 years on, they signed over the IP to the framework. So we own the framework now. And in a couple of days' time, I'm going to send you the report. Social Ventures Australia has been measuring the impact of black card training at Commonwealth Bank on individuals over the last 5 years of us rolling out that framework. So I can't wait to share this work with you, and I think it'll be the first of its kind in terms of having evidence-based research or data on the impact of a cultural education program such as Black Card. I'm not saying that we're the best or we're the only one out there. What I'm saying is that there's many providers that are delivering some type of cultural awareness or cultural competence program, but our program is strategically aligned to a framework. And I think that's what's important. The framework at Commonwealth Bank, it actually underpins their RAP. It supports their RAP. So if the RAP falls over, they still have that framework. And when you talk about cultural capability at Commonwealth Bank, with there's 46,000 employees across the country, the narrative is consistent when they talk about cultural capability because it's operating on Aboriginal terms of reference. And I would love for you to come and do some black card training, sit in, have a look what we do, and then see how we can partner up and work together with some of the work that you're doing and clients that you're working with.
Yeah.
And how we can leverage off black cards framework and see how we can incorporate those there's 4 principles there that you're talking about for that Code Australia.
Yeah, and what I really like about this idea around Indigenous cultural indicators and the project that you guys have is that when we talk about these projects that look at our own indicators, it makes sense that in terms of Indigenous companies particularly in this science space, there's a bit of starting to be a bit of a competitive natural growth with technology and science and the push. There's new organisations starting up every second day, that look at data analysts and all these type of different opportunities. But what the cultural indicators aim to do is say, hey, like you work within your jurisdiction around cultural indicators, and I work within my jurisdiction, and so on. So then there is no competitive nature when it comes to Indigenous peoples competing in the space, because the indicators are our traditional. It's basically looking at first law and with the indicators as a way of ensuring that we're working within our jurisdiction of our own first law,
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that you highlighted that. Even though we've got to wrap up, I just want to say that Aboriginal society is a group-based society, right? The Western world is a highly individualistic society. It's all about the individual and the rights of the individual and so forth. The Aboriginal society is also a non-competitive society, and it's a non-judgmental society. So how do we consolidate what Aboriginal terms of reference is, because that's our knowledge in terms of operating a business where we don't feel the need to compete with other blackfellas in business. So I'll give you a quick example. Black Card has never tendered for a piece of work. So we deliver training to Google. We look after, like Endemol Shine, they produce TV like Survivor and MasterChef. Look after CommBank and ANZ Bank. We got some pretty big clients on board, but we refuse to be drawn over into white terms of reference and to participate in a tendering process. And on the Sunshine Coast, the lands of the Gubbi peoples, there are traditional owners here that deliver cultural education. And there's businesses in my community that come to Black Card, and I'm like, I'll reach out to the local mob and see if they're going to put in. If they're going to put in, then why would I compete with them? And that creates conflict.
Yeah.
And we have a society that goes back tens of thousands of years that had all of these protocols in place and rules of engagement which lessened the potential for conflict.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do. We need to, we need our own mob first to consolidate what Aboriginal terms of reference is, and then you're conscious of when you're being drawn over into Western terms of reference, which is being highly competitive and an individual, and then the lateral violence with that judgmentalism. There's a whole lot more that, Braz, you and I could talk about for days. And I can't wait to get sister girl Amber on the podcast. So, look, I just want to say thank you so much for jumping on. And I'm trying to keep the podcast to 1 hour so that a lot of our Aboriginal radio stations can play the podcast in their 1 hour segments, all right? And one of them, big shout out to Jackie Tim and Trevor Tim up there in Cairns, Bumma Bipara Aboriginal radio station, play Black Magic Woman podcast. I heard it's every Tuesday and they repeat it again on a Saturday. So to all the mob there in Cairns, thank you for listening and supporting Black Magic Woman as well. And a big shout out to our Aboriginal community radio stations that are reaching out to us and saying we need more Aboriginal content, on the airwaves. So they'll be listening to this, brother. They'll know already straight away when this drops. They'll hear it on their local Aboriginal radio station. So how deadly is that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it'd be great to get back north too.
Well, can't wait. And let's stay connected. I'll jump onto LinkedIn. I've got your email address now, bros, and I've got your mobile number. So
yeah.
I'll be reaching out, and we'll have a yarn. We'll do a Zoom. Let's just start thinking about what we can do together. Very exciting. Can't wait. But look, thank you very much for jumping on. Really appreciate your time. And have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Anytime. I think we're going to do part 2 because we didn't even talk about your music career and the podcast and the ghost stories. So I'm going to hold it to you, right? We're going to do Luke Briscoe part 2 in the new year.
That sounds deadly.
Too deadly, Buzz. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
You too. Jumana, Joel. See ya.
No worries. Yo. I know I always say this, but how deadly is that brother? Like, if you don't know, Luke Briscoe or Indigi Lab, I'm pretty sure that you've already gone to LinkedIn or Google or Instagram or Facebook or just to the World Wide Web to search for his company. This brother, you know, his experiences in creative industries, digital communication, project management, community, international policy, and of course, cultural development. Luke founded the award-winning company Indigi Lab to create innovative projects and STEM initiatives for social and environmental change. The Indigi Lab framework and principles into researching and project planning is guided by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 7th Generation Principle. He believes that these frameworks support real sustainable approaches to Aboriginal and Torres and Islander advancement in sciences and technology. Infuse your life with action. Don't wait for it to happen. Make it happen. Make your own future. Make your own hope. Make your own love. And whatever your beliefs, honour your Creator, not by passively waiting for grace to come down from upon high, but by doing what you can to make grace happen yourself, right now, right down here on earth. Those are the words from Luke Briscoe, and I'm on a high. I'm like a business thing going through my head. I shared an article already on LinkedIn around the Indigenous cultural indicators and some of the things that he's written. So, yeah, look, go to LinkedIn and just follow this lad. If you're not already following him, go and follow him on LinkedIn, or go to LinkedIn and follow me, Mandanara Bales, and you'll see that I'm following him, and I'm following a lot of other deadly black fellas that, otherwise wouldn't be known. A lot of people probably don't know about the amazing black businesses and entrepreneurs, scientists, music producers, agriculturalists, doctors, lawyers. We've had all types of people on this podcast. So, yeah, look, I hope you've enjoyed the yarn, and I can't wait to jump on again and do Luke Briscoe Part 2. So on that note, that's all we have for now. Until next time, bye for now.
Don't forget to follow Black Magic Woman podcast on all social media platforms. To keep up to date with the latest episodes and news, head to blackmagicwoman.com.au. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, and please feel free to share the podcast with your family and friends.